Legendary investor Jim Rogers.
The one and only Jim Rogers.
He is an iconic legendary investor, and for me, most notably, the adventure capitalist, Mr. Jim Rogers.
We've had the longest period of American history without a big problem. That doesn't mean it can't go on for 50 years, but it never has.
Are you saying that the United States is a corrupt country in some ways?
Well, I have been investing a long time, and I have learned that that's not a good way to invest.
Would you think Uzbekistan could be a good fourth passport if that's a place you want to invest?
Well, having more than one passport is a wise thing to do, if you ask me.
Jim Rogers, it is good to speak with you again.
I am delighted to be here, Andrew. It's nice to see you again.
You talked a lot at Nomad Capitalist Live. It's a number of months ago now. Uzbekistan. I'm hearing a lot of people talk about Uzbekistan. We've got some folks coming in the year to come who are investing in that and many other frontier markets. Here's a question that people have posed. They say there's too much risk investing in a frontier market. Things can change. The government can change. What do you say to that?
That sounds like the United States, doesn't it? I would worry more about the things changing in the U.S. than I would in places like Uzbekistan and other places. Yes, some are very volatile. There's no question about that. But if you think the United States is stable and not going to worry you, you should stop investing. Or maybe you should start investing, because you'll find out very quickly, oh my gosh, these people in Washington are nuts. We can't trust them. How can anybody make any trustworthy decisions based on Washington bureaucrats and politicians? But you have to do your homework. You shouldn't just say, oh, there's a new country, let's invest there. No. You must have a reason. You must do your research, and you must have a reason to invest there.
And so your reason for markets like Uzbekistan is what? Make that case for us here in 2024.
Well, Uzbekistan, first of all, is a huge country with lots of resources, natural resources. At various times in history, Uzbekistan has been unbelievably successful and powerful. I don't know if you remember Tamerlane, but Tamerlane at one time conquered a lot of the world. He lived in Uzbekistan, and the Uzbeks were very skilled at various and sundry things, and so they conquered a lot of the world. Now, in recent years, the Soviets, they were part of the Soviet Union, and as you know, the Soviets ruined everything. The Soviets were good at ruining things, and they ruined Uzbekistan. But after being ruined by the Soviets, first of all, that made things very, very cheap in Uzbekistan, including the stock market. Now there's a group of people running Uzbekistan who certainly say the right things and are doing the right things the way you and I would run an economy or society. You open it up, you give incentives, and you help people invest and make money. And that seems to be happening in Uzbekistan.
Why do you think that people think it's more likely that a country like Uzbekistan or Georgia or any of those post-Soviet, post-communist countries, why do they think it's more likely that those countries, a couple decades on, go back to communist policies and ruin their investment more than a country like the U.S. wouldn't keep going in the wrong direction towards greater socialist anti-investor policies?
Well, my experience has been is mainly because they don't know much about Uzbekistan. They can find Washington, D.C. on a map, but they cannot find Uzbekistan on a map. They don't know anything about it, but they all took civics classes when they were in school. They know where Washington is, and they think they know what it's going to do. They don't, but they think they do. But they don't even know where Uzbekistan is, so they know they don't know anything about Uzbekistan. Therefore, they think it must be dangerous.
Right. And you obviously wrote Adventure Capitalist. You've wrote around the world. You've been to these countries. I've been to these countries. And you start to see, oh, okay, people own property here. People are making money here. Things may be different in many ways, but they work somewhat the same. Is that what you took from your experiences?
Well, yes, but there are many countries that just because they're cheap they have resources doesn't mean it's a good place to invest. There are criminals everywhere. There are all kinds of problems conceivably everywhere. You have to, I anyway, like to find the place when it is changing. If you find something that's cheap that is changing positively, you might make a lot of money. You can't just invest in a country where you turn out your map and say, oh, there's a country, let's invest there. It takes a lot more. For me, it takes a lot more than that.
One of the countries that was talked about 10 or 12 years ago a lot, especially in our circles, was Mongolia. And the case was the same. Smaller domestic population, much smaller, very small domestic population, but lots of minerals next to Russia, next to China. People seem to have kind of moved on from Mongolia. I mean, I remember going to Ulaanbaatar. They had the Louis Vuitton store. That was the sign of the growth. The Louis Vuitton store is now closed. It no longer exists. What happened in Mongolia, and what did we learn from that?
I don't know, because I didn't invest in Mongolia. I never bought that story. And I don't really know what happened because I wasn't paying attention. I do know that it's not a hot investment market right now.
Yeah.
First of all, Mongolia has very small. They only have 3 or 4 million people, don't they?
Right. Yeah, I think 3 million.
Well, I mean, that's usually not a great place to invest because the market just isn't that big. Now, Mongolia, if you look at a map, it's huge, it's gigantic, but there are not many people who live there.
Right. And so the case is you need a little bit larger domestic market. I mean, Uzbekistan is what, 10 or 12? I mean, is that kind of the size that you need? Is it geographical proximity? I mean, what are the things that you think make Uzbekistan, or, I've talked about Cambodia, they have 16 million people. What maybe makes that different to a Mongolia in your mind?
Well, we'll find out, but Uzbekistan is much bigger population-wise. It does have a lot of resources that can be exploited and are being exploited now. It's got some rich neighbors. It's close to Kazakhstan, China. These are places that, in theory, will be big markets. And if the government continues to open its borders, give people incentives and not tax them to death, that's the kind of places where capitalists, where entrepreneurs like to do business.
If you were able to get Uzbek citizenship through a presidential decree, is that something that you, Jim Rogers, the investor, would be interested in? Or fill in the blank of any other country that you think is up and coming?
Well, having more than one passport is a wise thing to do, if you ask me. We need a plan B, no matter what your passport, if it's U.S., which is a phenomenal country, etc. But in the U.S., you can have more than one passport legally. You can have as many as you want, which is good, if you ask me. And it's something that people should do because you need, in case things go wrong and you only have one passport, you might be in serious trouble. So having a second passport or third or fourth is a wise thing to do if you can get it.
You think Uzbekistan could be a good fourth passport if that's a place you want to invest? Maybe you get a leg up?
Well, what I know now, yes, but I haven't explored, I haven't researched the passport aspect.
Yeah. Let me
tell you, it's a fabulous country to visit. It's amazing. It's beautiful. It got some most amazing tourist sites, man-made and natural, and many things going for Uzbekistan.
Good food, Question on the passport front. Just recently talked to some of our Georgian friends whom you met at Nomad Capitalist Live. Georgia now has visa-free access to China. They're joining a growing number of countries, almost none of them Western, that China allows to visit. Now, you can get a visa to go to China if you're a Westerner. It's not the end of the world. But what do you take from the fact that China is opening up to more of these neutral countries, and what do you see as a business or investment opportunity in that China wants to bring more countries that you haven't thought about into their fold, and that's their ecosystem?
I mean, China's been opening up for 40 years now. They haven't opened up completely, obviously. That's why they continue to do it. But the more open they are, the more markets and the more commerce they have. And usually everybody's better off That's the only explanation I can give you because I don't know any more than that. But I do know that China has been opening for, 40 years.
Do you look at, though, talk of now in some of the Western world, a trade war with China, to where China says, hey, listen, we'll do somewhat perhaps what Russia's done throughout this war the last 2 years. We've got lots of other places in the world we can do business with. I kind of go back to that first question. What is it the average American, where you're from, where I'm from, doesn't quite understand that China maybe doesn't need to open up to the West as much as they just need to open up to the rest of the world? Do you agree with that thesis?
Well, everybody needs to open up as much as they can. When I say everybody, I mean everybody. The U.S. is very open, but we could be more open. Everybody could be more open. And I suspect that's what China's doing. They know that the more open they are, the more commerce they will have and a better economy they will have. I mean, I have not spoken to Mr. Xi. You can ask him.
Do you have any thought, on some of the stuff in the U.S.? Chinese citizens can't buy our land. The U.S. is an open market. It's a place where foreigners can buy stuff. Do you think that restrictions specifically targeting Chinese citizens, obviously, who also most of whom don't know Xi, does that help the U.S.? Does that help Canada? Does that help countries that do that, or does it matter?
I don't see how those kind of restrictions in America can help America at all. We are the land of the free and the home of the brave. I hope. If we are the land of the free, people can come, as they have for a couple of 100 years, and do business and have great prosperity. But their prosperity adds to our prosperity too.
Right after we met, Charlie Munger passed away. He was an advocate of companies like BYD, which I know the electric car manufacturer many years ago, Elon Musk and many in the United States were laughing at them. They've now surpassed Tesla in a number of metrics. Do you follow at all that, U.S. versus China, automotive market, or in a broader sense, what is your thought on Charlie Munger's thesis that you're going to see Chinese companies come in and start to eat some of the American companies' lunch at lower prices?
Andrew, that's the way the world has been working for a few hundred years. The British ate, the Dutch ate people's lunch, and then the British came along and ate their lunch, and then the Americans came along and ate the British lunch. This has been going on for a long, long time. It's going to continue to go, I hope. Countries get more sophisticated, more educated, more ambitious, and they start doing new things. You remember Sony? Well, Sony didn't exist 100 years ago. Now it's one of the largest and most prosperous electronic companies in the world. But you don't remember K-Part, you barely remember RCA. These are companies that Sony put out of business. Do we regret that? Of course we regret it, but it's the way the world works. And I'd rather have a Sony TV than a K-Part TV.
Is China going to do that? Because I keep going back, if I'm talking to that person that says, I live in the United States, we've got something special here. And this is the one, it's a special love, this moat we have in the U.S., this is the one that cannot be defeated. Do you think that China is one that will defeat some of these U.S. companies or take away big share?
Well, it's already starting to happen, yes. The Chinese are world leaders in solar energy for whatever reason. I cannot think of any American company that's a world leader in solar energy. The Chinese produce thousands of engineers every year. I'm sure some of them are hopeless. But we know we produce thousands of engineers, and many of them are hopeless. But some of the Chinese engineers are going to be very good. Look at Tencent, look at Baidu, look at Alibaba. Those are companies that didn't exist 20 years ago, but they have good engineers.
I know you're not a prognosticator on hot stock tips. China's gotten beaten up very badly. I look at companies, listed in Hong Kong. The gas company is down 60%. The ferry is down 50%. Banks I got into have done all right, but you see very attractive valuations on some pretty straightforward stuff. How do you know when it's time to go in on China? Because again, you've got people who are saying the population is shrinking. It's going to be a demographic bust. How do you know when to go in?
You listen to Nomad Capital. They will tell you. They tell you when to go.
We're not in the stock tip business.
The Chinese market has been one of the worst markets in the world in the last 2 or 3 years, partly because of the virus.
Yeah.
We think the virus may have started in China. It certainly affected them badly. And they had a huge real estate bubble. Had maybe one of the worst or best real estate bubbles in history, depending on how you look at it. It finally popped. Beijing tried to stop it for a long time. They never were successful. Now the market has popped the real estate bubble. But Andrew, it was huge. And it takes a long time, normally, historically, for a bubble like that to take for people to recover. And that's part of the problem in China right now. They had this gigantic bubble which popped, and it's hurting. But one of the reasons it's hurting bad is because they had one of the worst viruses, one of the worst epidemic of virus of other countries. You put the things together, China is suffering.
Does their response to COVID trouble you? Because that's what folks in the West would say was they went way too far. Just purely as an investor, forget as a political commentator, a personal freedom seeker, does it bother you as an investor?
Well, what did they do that was wrong? I mean, they closed down places. Many countries did that. I don't know what they did wrong. But main thing.
Well, they'd say, oh, they went too much. They went too far. They went much further than, Western governments.
I don't know that. I do not have a definitive answer to whether they went too far or not. If you know that, then you make the judgment. I do know that many parts of China were closed down during the virus, but many parts of everywhere were closed down. I live in Singapore. Many parts of Singapore were closed down. The U.S., everybody. Not everybody, but nearly everybody.
Talk about the fact that I think it's like a single-digit percentage of Chinese citizens own equities, if I read that correctly. Do you think that this real estate bubble, from your cultural understanding of the Chinese culture, does that inspire more people to get involved in their stock market? Because historically, people wanted to own property. I mean, property, for many people in Asia, it's considered the bank. They do not sell. They are not in a rush to sell. Do you think this maybe changes some mindsets?
Well, of course it will. The fact that the real estate bubble was so huge and then it popped and so many people have suffered, of course it makes people re-examine the real estate market in the future. They're all saying, many of them are saying, oh, forget real estate. It's crooked. They're thieves. They cheat you, just like they will all over the world. They will say when the stock market bubble collapses, if there's a bubble, all the new investors start screaming about how the market is rigged and they're crooked and they cheat you and you shouldn't invest in stocks. Then their children will come back into the market. But this is the way human beings have been and the way markets have been all over the world for a long time. It's not my first rodeo. I've seen this game before.
It is interesting, though, as you see with this demographic issue that China has, as the government tries to push people into some sort of private pensions, go to the bank, we'll match your money, kind of the 401k-ization of China. Wonder if that drives more money into Chinese stocks. But let's talk about, you mentioned Sony. Japan, 3.5-decade highs. Warren Buffett talked about getting into some of those soka shoshas a couple of years ago. What do you make of what's happening in Japan? Some incredible performances in the last year.
Well, you may remember that I own Japan. I sheepishly will.
So you're the guy.
I've owned Japan for a while, since the big tsunami, as a matter of fact. But I sheepishly will tell you that I sold a week or two ago. And that's despite the fact that I would constantly tell people Japan may go back to new highs. And in a moment of weakness, I sold. Foolish move, fool that I am. But I do suspect that the Japanese market will continue to go higher. I mean, Andrew, the Japanese market is down for 35 years. This is an astonishing situation with what happened there. And now, for many reasons, one of which is that the central bank has been buying shares, and they've changed the laws to encourage people to buy shares. I mean, there are many reasons the Japanese market is going up finally after 35 years. I'm just sorry I sold, because I suspect it's going to continue for a while.
You sold a couple of weeks ago. You still did incredibly well.
But yeah, okay, fine. But I'm like everybody else. I say, oh my gosh, look at what I've missed.
Yeah, sure.
And we all look at what could have been.
The concern, again, I'm just talking to this kind of average American who has worries about things like currency. I mean, I remember the first time I went to Japan, it was like 75 yen to the dollar. It's almost half that now. It's gone down twice, from that level. Warren Buffett, I think, talked about a rare moment of issuing a bunch of yen-denominated debt to go into the stock market. Obviously, he's dealing in billions of dollars. Most of us aren't. When you buy a Japanese stock, or if you're advising someone that's buying a Japanese stock, should they be doing anything to protect them against currency fluctuations, or they just go in and they just buy the stock?
Well, it depends on who you are and what you know. If you don't know how to hedge your currency, don't try. It's a difficult thing to learn with your own money until you know what you're doing. So, no, I expect the yen. I mean, the Japanese yen, I can remember when the yen was 350. You said 75 or something. I can remember it was 350 to the US dollar. And now it's up from then, but it's down a lot in the last few years. I don't know why the yen is as strong as it is. They have printed huge amounts of money. They have run up huge debt. The population declines every month. I mean, Japan's got serious problems looking down the road. They don't like immigrants, so there's very little immigration to make up for the population's problems, labor problems. But in the meantime, because they print so much money and they give such incentives, the market's going through the roof and will probably continue.
What's the long case for that then? Is the idea that a Marubeni, for example, or an Itochu has so much business all around the world that it's not really a Japanese company? I mean, if you look at the Japanese domestic issues, why be long Japanese equities at all?
Well, if you can own a market that goes from 10,000 to 40,000 over not too long a period of time, that's a good case, even if the currency is not very strong. I mean, if the Japanese currency goes down 50%, but the market quadruples, you're still ahead. And remember, a declining currency helps some countries. If you're a Japanese company and you export, you're happy that the currency goes down.
So Toyota, right.
And the Japanese tour industry loves it. They love the currency to go down because there's more tourists. It becomes a cheaper destination for many foreigners. So they're both good and bad to a declining currency. I don't advocate a declining currency for any country, but we do have to look at the complete picture.
What do you make of the AI revolution? That's something, if you weren't invested in, you missed out on. Is that something that you get involved in? And what are your thoughts on the AI boom?
Well, I'm not smart enough. I have learned in my investment career that I'm not as technologically knowledgeable as many people, and if I don't understand something, I don't invest. But I do know enough about AI to know that it's going to change everything we know, Andrew. It's going to put a lot of people out of business, but electricity put a lot of people out of business and changed everything we know. This is the way the world works, and AI is certainly going to be spectacular. If I knew, and I don't, but if I knew which companies would benefit the most, I hope I'd be smart enough to buy them.
So Jim Rogers advocates against, if I'm understanding this correctly, advocates against FOMO, fear of missing out. Don't just buy it because you think everyone else is buying it.
Well, I have been investing a long time, and I have learned that that's not a good way to invest.
I'm going to come back to, I got an existential question for you. We'll talk about Trump and Biden. Nomad Capitalist Live is our annual event. It's coming up this September. You can go to nomadcapitalist.com/live. You were there. We've had Robert Kiyosaki and Doug Casey. I know you know some of those guys. This year, Nigel Farage, and I think your friend Michelle McCory, and the CEO of AirAsia. Maybe just give us a brief thoughts on your experience at this annual 4-day event and what you took from it and some of the people you met.
Well, I have only been once, but I will say to you, which I said at the time, it's a remarkable concept, a very good concept, because people do need to know about options, about where they live, how they live. So I commend you. I commend you. I hope you continue, and I hope it gets bigger, and I hope more people learn. Doesn't mean people have to move to a different country or get different citizenship or anything else, but they need to know about it, if nothing else.
Well, I appreciate that. And we're taking a page from your book. We've got a lot of different people who are on the ground in some of these emerging and frontier markets going to come and talk about that. So a little bit less doom and gloom and a lot more of the capitalist stuff. So you can nomadcapitalist.com/live. Existential question for you. You mentioned, people will go to business due to AI. People will go to business they did go to business due to electricity. If you're someone who has a successful business, you've built wealth, and you're not exactly sure how to pivot, or you try and pivot and you fail, what's your thought on, you have a pile of money over here, how do you protect yourself? I mean, do you always have to be pivoting to the next thing, or at a certain point you say, you know what, I'm going to stick to what I know. Maybe my company won't make it, but I'm going to keep a pile of wealth. I mean, how do you approach these big systemic changes?
Well, I have learned to stay with what I know. I would love to invest in AI, but I do not know which companies will do well in AI. And there are people who do, but the same, that could be, Andrew, once upon a time, believe it or not, radio was a gigantic growth stock, a gigantic concept, a gigantic bubble. We have had lots of new technologies in history. And when we do have something, the railroads, believe it or not, the railroads once upon a time were gigantic bubble. In fact, I think it's accurate that railroad stocks have still not gotten back to their highs during the huge bubble. But railroad was a great new concept, a great new technology. We've had this happen many times. I hope it happens many, many more times in the future. And if you know what you're doing, you'll make a lot of money.
Do you agree with the positions that a Warren Buffett or a Bill Ackman have advocated over the years in things like railroads? Sort of people thought this was dead, but it actually is still very much needed. It's not sexy, but it's needed. Do you like that approach?
Well, I mean, I know that railroads are needed. No matter where you go in the world, you will see that there are viable railroads that have huge businesses. Just about every country in the world has railroads that are viable and that are successful and prosperous. So, yeah, I know that. I don't own any railroad stocks, but they're certainly viable and can be very prosperous. So do it if you know what you're doing.
It's interesting you mentioned the radio example. I know people who this day are still on radio stations. Heck, I had a friend recently, he called me and said, "You're going to hate me." He said, "I bought another radio station." He paid $50,000 for a radio station. This must have been millions of dollars not that long ago. So I suppose that someone answers my question about those who hold on too long. But let's talk about in the United States. There's an election coming up this year, Trump versus Biden. Do you invest differently based on the run-up to that election or whomever wins?
Well, usually when any country, but the U.S. has an election, somebody wins and his friends do well. It's the way the world works. If you win, you reward your friends. And all you got to do is figure out who Joe's friends are. And maybe you'll buy their stocks because you know they're going to do well. They're going to get more business. They're going to become more prosperous. They're going to be more exciting because Joe, the new president, likes them. And he will give them more business. I didn't say it was good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way the world works.
Are you saying that the United States is a corrupt country in some ways?
I didn't say that's corruption. I said that's the way the world works. If if George Washington wins the election, chances are he's going to give more business to the people who supported him. Is that corruption? I don't know. Many people would discuss that or debate that with you, that it's natural for George Washington to do business with the people he knows and the people that have supported him. It can turn into corruption, certainly can, but on the surface, it's not corruption.
Are you more inclined to invest in the broad US market if one particular person wins, or you think that's a bad way to think for investors? Because surely there are people out there who say, if Trump wins, the market's going to take off. I want to be part of it. Do you share that?
Well, the market is making all-time highs. The market has taken off for whatever reason. So whoever wins, yes, maybe the market will continue to go higher and higher, but the market's been going higher for a long time, and the longest in American history. So one should at least be careful and question what's going on. We've had the longest period of American history without a big problem. That doesn't mean it can't go on for 50 years, but it never has.
Do you think that the U.S. market is more expensive for your taste compared to some of the other markets where perhaps there are other risks, but you find better values?
Well, the U.S. market is making all-time highs, but so is India, so is Japan, so is many places making all-time highs. Maybe one would say, well, wait a minute, if everybody's making all-time highs, maybe we should step back and worry. The whole world can't be that successful and that prosperous all at the same time. At least it has rarely happened in history. And when it has happened in history, it has often led to problems. So I'm skeptical of what's going on. I have not sold short. I am not selling short yet, but I see what's happening.
Thoughts on interest rate policy? Someone asked it and said, what do you suggest people do as perhaps lowering rates takes longer than some folks expected?
Well, yes, just keep your money in short-term interest-bearing securities if you're worried about that. If you worry that interest rates will be higher, don't go committing your money to a long period yet. Just keep your powder dry, and when the opportunities come that you think are coming, take advantage of them.
I think people underestimate having some cash around. I think that's worthwhile, is it not, to be able to pounce in times like these?
Well, it's always, history shows it's always good to have some reserves. Now, Andrew, you do have to worry. In 2007, there were a lot of people in Europe who said, oh, this is going to collapse. And so they put their money in cash. They found high interest bearing cash to try to ride out the storm. They put their money in Icelandic krona, very high yields, but they got wiped out because the krona was a disaster. So you have to be careful about which cash you use and which instruments.
Yeah,
This is not an easy way to make money. Everybody thinks it is because they look at the TV shows and they say, oh, look at Sally. She bought Apple. I could have bought Apple too. Well, why didn't you if you could have bought Apple too?
Well, let me end on that because with where you live in Singapore, people can say, I could have moved to Singapore like Jim Rogers or like anybody else. It was a harder decision in decades past. And the price has increased. The price of access has increased accordingly over the years. But my question is, again, going back to that person who lives in the United States and says, hey, nowhere else can be any better, nowhere else can be any different. The world pretty much functions the same. I think that one of the problems of the US, which I would argue will have greater implications, is people are just at each other's throats. Talk about your experience living outside of the US. I don't think they're at each other's throats in Singapore, but they should hear it from you.
Well, Singapore prides itself on having very little corruption, very little bribery, etc. My experience is that that's a valid reputation for this country. The guy who made Singapore successful, insisted, he paid cabinet members $1 million because he didn't want them taking bribes. He didn't want them being able to take from people. He thought that would be a way to make sure everybody, first of all, he would get high quality, smart people who would be successful. And secondly, they wouldn't be taking bribes. Now, from my experience, that's been correct. It's worked. Maybe there are things going on that I don't know about, but Singapore has been a very successful country for the past 40 or 50 years. The problem with that, Andrew, is that every society has a saying that, rags to rags in 3 generations. The first generation makes the success, the second generation builds on it, and then the third generation ruins it. They spend all the money and they ruin the success. So nothing lasts forever, but so far Singapore has been very successful since the whole thing started.
I think that's perhaps what people, again, where we're from in the U.S., would like to happen, is the idea that it's rags to riches and it's just always riches. And it's been that way, but I feel like if I look at why people are at each other's throats, perhaps part of it is this idea that, how many generations in, nobody can make a bad decision. Well, people are making bad decisions. The momentum, in my opinion, is going in the wrong direction. And now you have people on each side of the aisle. It seems more vitriolic than ever. I don't think that you see that in most of these other countries. And I have to imagine that gives an extra stability to a place like Singapore, both to live and perhaps to keep your capital.
Well, those are decisions that people have to make on their own. But I will say to you, the United States, of which I am a citizen, taxpayer, and voter, is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world. And the debt goes higher every day. Not every year, every day, the debt goes higher and higher. History is pretty clear that this usually leads to problems, no matter what the country, no matter what the period in history. I don't particularly like saying it since I am an American taxpayer, but I have to deal with facts.
I'll throw in one more because you mentioned hiring smart people. I feel like the UAE and some of the Gulf countries have copied that. I have seen some of these financial talking heads say that Abu Dhabi will be a market they're very interested in. Was just looking at that myself yesterday. Do you see some of what Singapore accomplished as possible for the markets in the UAE? Saudi Arabia is another one being talked about, et cetera.
Well, Saudi Arabia, since you mentioned that, has been an extremely closed society and country for many decades, but now it is opening up. The new guy, whatever he's called, is young, and he has lived in the outside world, and he's trying to change Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia probably has a very interesting future, few decades, because they are opening up. They have vast wealth, and they have lots of brains because they bring a lot of expats in. So that's happening in the UAE. It's happening in some Middle Eastern countries. On the other hand, looking at the Middle East, Andrew, if there's a war, that's probably where it's going to be for whatever reason. So be careful. Yes, it's a great place to live right now. And many, many, many people are moving there from all over the world. But just remember, if there's a war, it might well be in the Middle East.
Another country, Saudi Arabia, that our Georgian friends just got access to. Interesting to see, from our perspective, some of these lesser quality passports of 10 or 20 years ago becoming much more competitive. Anyway, Jim Rogers, thank you so much as always for your insights.
Well, I commend you for what you guys are doing. Because I hope that you continue to open people's minds and experience to new possibilities and to a plan B. Yes, I'm an American citizen. My family's been in America since 1607. And we're not planning to leave, or none of us ever have. But one does need to know about other possibilities, and one does need to have a plan B, no matter where you are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And Nomad Capitalist Live, for those who are watching, you can go to nomadcapitalist.com/live and learn more about that. A lot of emerging markets to be discussed. 4 full days. We'll see you there.